Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Quote Unquote with KK. Let me remind you a full report of our 2024 Healthcare and Life Sciences India Investment Manifesto is now available on our website. You can access it there. Working on the manifesto was an exciting journey, and based on the manifesto, we concluded that all cohort of the Indian generational population and people globally want to reconnect and experience harmony through the three H. These are happiness, happenings, and hookup. And as I said in my last episode as well, this is the theme for our podcast throughout our 24-25 season. Now, coming to our podcast today, we had discussed about AI in our last season and discussed about India's artificial intelligence growth story. Now, there are many gadgets, including our mobile phones, that are coming up with next generation of semiconductor chip that are enabling AI. Let me tell you, my Samsung Galaxy Fold 5 phone just released a update called One UI 6.1 last month and does a ton of artificial intelligence based work and functionality to improve on my experience on the phone. It's like working on a full-fledged computer. Following this, last week Apple announced that they are coming out with their M4 chip that allows for AI tasks on their product. And many other gadget manufacturers in the consumer electronics space are developing their own chip to accelerate the adoption of artificial intelligence as well. Now, to enable all this artificial intelligence and what bet we have in our investment manifesto for India, there is a need for developing a whole host of proprietary semiconductor chip to power up the artificial intelligence applications on the data servers as well. But that's not the end here. Let me roll back to the COVID time. You see, the booking to delivery times for cars and many gadgets were for over a year because the semiconductor chip that powered up these cars and gadgets were not being delivered for over a year because China was in short supply or was holding the supply to India for whatever reason, whether it was our conflict on the borders or it had its own priorities to make India wait for the supply. As a result, one of the startups that I was mentoring was creating a novel consumer electronic hardware product and had difficult time getting the prototypes assembled because of the chip and component shortages. Now, closer home, India was also harboring its own semiconductor chip making ambition and came out with a policy to incentivize the Make in India semiconductor chip. But we're still in that waiting game for some of the big players to enter India to set up their manufacturing in India so that the current disruptions and supply chain issues are sorted out and things are made faster for just not for the industry but for the hardware manufacturers in India as well as for the consumer to be getting those products cheaper, better, and faster. Now, let's kind of understand that in our last podcast on AI, we said that to enable artificial intelligence, there is a need for semiconductor chip at various levels, both at the user, at the intermediate layer, at the servers, so that things can speed up the delivery of artificial intelligence and chatbot and whatever applications that are enabled on artificial intelligence. As a result, artificial intelligence chip will make up for 25% of all the semiconductor chip by 2027. Hence, given the current shortages and the race for the next generation of AI enabling chip, there is going to be a huge time to deliver. So why are chip manufacturers investing heavily in the fabrication of chip, not just in India, but many other countries? Taking cues from this, we have signed MOUs and our first chip will enter with a made in India tag by next year. But let's also understand some of the global development. Just last month, NVIDIA, one of the chip makers and graphic processing unit creator, released its own AI enabling chip and architecture and has leapfrogged into the 2 trillion market cap club, which includes Microsoft, Apple, and a few others. And this one, NVIDIA, happens to be one of the fastest to reach into this club. But let's understand, NVIDIA has never entered into the arena of chip making and fabrication. It has left that to Taiwan's TSMC to do that and supply their designed chip globally. Now, some of the bets that we have taken, even on the healthcare and life sciences, need some of those chips, and we need to also accelerate this for the future of the race that we are entering into. But let's understand, some experts have said that India lags behind 50 years in the semiconductor chip making and fabrication race. But how do we catch up? Let's understand that India leapfrogged from nowhere to one of the leaders in the telecom arena, being one of the largest data provider and is now creating creating its own native 5G and 6G technology. So it's possible for India to catch up like it did in the telecom space, in the chip making space. But that needs both the government and the private sector initiative and intervention and invest. To discuss all these issues around powering up of AI with semiconductor chips and hardware to lead the AI race of the future from India, I have invited a very distinguished expert to discuss this. And today's topic of our podcast is moving around the future of chip in AI dominated India. Listeners, let me introduce you Nitin Dahad. So let's start with what Nitin Dahad profile comes from our artificial intelligence based chat GPT. His profile reads as follows, and then let me add about Nitin that chat GPT does not know. Nitin Dahad is an accomplished individual with a diverse background. Here are some key points about education. He holds an electronic engineering degree from City University. Career path: engineer. Nitin started his career in the electronics industry as an engineer. Journalist. He transitioned into journalism covering technology and industry trends. Entrepreneur. Nitin co-founded a publication called The Chili in the early 2000s. Startup experience. He was part of ARC International Startup team and played a role in taking it public. Government advisor. Nitin also held a position with the government promoting the UK technology globally across various regions. Current role: editor-in-chief of embedded.com. Nitin oversees content related to embedded systems. Correspondent for EE Times. He contributes to EE Times, a leading electronic industry publication. Nitin's multifaceted journey reflects his passion for technology, entrepreneurship, and communication. Now, let me tell you what ChatGPT didn't tell you. I met Nitin in 2011-2012 when I was part of the NASCOM Product Conclave Committee in Bangalore. It was a very engaging conversation with Nitin. He was at that point in time with TechSpark, a leading strategy and technology communication firm. I remember discussing a lot of issues around the India-UK tech startup ecosystem and areas of collaboration. We have been exchanging ideas since then. So why Nitin? Let me tell you one thing, that Nitin has over 30 years of experience working with various semiconductor players, which included National Semiconductors, Marconi Instrument, GE Plessey Semiconductors, ARC International, CIP Technology, and a host of clients that he has advised in the semiconductor industry through his own firm. Moreover, Nitin is also advising and is on the board of University of Hertfordshire and Essex. So he just not only connects the semiconductor industry, but he connects the academia, the government, and also plays a role in connecting India and various other countries across the globe on technology. With this background, I felt that it would be pertinent to discuss today's issues that I have just outlined and many more with Nitin. So welcome to our podcast show, Nitin. It's a pleasure having you back, this time on our platform, Quote Unquote, with KK. Nitin, let me start off the bat with a few questions on the Moore's Law, the basic tenet on which the whole semiconductor chip industry has been growing and evolving. And some experts, including Vinod Dham, believe that with AI, the Moore's Law is over. What's your view on it?
Well, it's not a scientific law per se. So it's basically something that Gordon Moore, talked about, sort of, I think in the 60s. Basically, he said the number of transistors will double every year. Obviously, that went to, I think he revised that 10 years later to it'll double every 2 years and the cost will come down. What's happening now is that doubling has sort of coincidentally happened over the years, and it's driven the industry as well a little bit into, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think what's happened now, we're getting down to the realms of sort of angstrom level, but it's more nanometer at the moment level technology, which basically means can you still put that doubling of transistors? So it's not really a limiting factor as per se. What it's actually trying to say is you won't be able to put so many more transistors on a piece of silicon so rapidly. And I think if you take that in a sort of scientific way, basically what people are talking, when people talk about Moore's law being dead, is, well, you can't put so many more transistors on that single chip. How can you develop more faster, better processes to enable the compute that enables the AI that will then sort of deliver whatever services we want?
So now the joke is that it's now going to be the Jensen's law.
Yeah, maybe. NVIDIA is dominating the semiconductor world, the electronics world, the GPU world, the AI world. So I think in a way, I think a more than $2 trillion cap, they have taken on this whole sort of mantle of delivering the GPUs for AI. And if you look at it, it's very high level GPUs, chips, tens of thousands of dollars per chip. So there is going to be at some point a need for, more more chips, to deliver the AI that we need. It's not all going to be delivered by NVIDIA in terms of, well, NVIDIA do the designs, but the chips, the technology to deliver that AI. So I think there's going to be a sort of need for competition. It's an interesting time because at the end of the day, the AI, the big thing right now is generative AI and large language models. And I've been to India at least twice this year, and I talked to people about semiconductors, AI, technology, and I met with an interesting company, and I think there's partly public information, partly non-public information, but a company called Ola, which is big in India, have spun off a company called Krutrim, which is basically doing India's own AI chip. Now, grand ambitions. I met with Sambit Sahu in Bangalore and or Bengaluru on my last visit. Very ambitious, a lot of confidential things he told me, but I think one of the things, what I will say is India has the ambition, but I'm not sure if you look at semiconductor manufacturing, which is basically one of the sort of things you sort of asked me to come on the show about. I think there is still a long way to go. If you look at China, for example, I think it's commandeered something like $150 billion worth of support for semiconductor sector alone for manufacturing.
Right.
India, I think, is on $10 or $15 billion. The US, although it's put the CHIPS Act with $52 billion, I think, and Europe with 46, I think there's a lot more when it comes to private and public money capitalized to develop these fabs. So, India is got a long way to go. I think the ambition is great, but I think there's still some activity that needs to be done, and it's going to be a long time before you become less dependent on chips from Taiwan or Samsung or even China.
Well, now that you've given a little bit flavor about where India is in terms of investment, your own newspaper and your media actually publishes global rankings on different areas, including semiconductors and chips. So, according to you, where does India stand in the global order?
I can tell you in terms of my readership, it's usually number 2 or 3 in our global readership, and I think that's the thirst for knowledge that people have in India, but also the design community is very strong in India. I mean, I think I've seen figures. India has 20% of the semiconductor design force for the world. But EE Times, where we've been publishing for over 52 years for the electronics and semiconductor industry, so it's a globally recognized brand. And I would say, obviously, India we've covered on and off. I'm going to take a little bit of a side story, if you like. So I actually started writing about India back in 1993, and that was the time when Manmohan Singh sort of initiated some of the reforms, and I was invited by the Indian government at that time, which was actually the Brussels India Trade Office. They sponsored me to go and meet with the Department of Electronics, Department of Telecommunications, and then a few other companies, including Rajiv Chandrasekhar at BPL Mobile. So I visited his factory there in 1993, and then a couple of other people like Tandon. So my point is, in the rankings, India has always been having this ambition, but I think one executive said it quite well to me on my recent visit to Bangalore just a few weeks ago. He said India has these initiatives, but then the government support doesn't follow up. And I think that's always been the case. If you look at the 1980s, Dr. M.J. Zarabi sort of initiated a Semiconductor Complex Limited. And, he had that great ambition. I think you were doing 5 micron chips at that time, which was, it was impressive. But I think it didn't follow up through with government support. And so it sort of got put on the back burner, but then had, people like Wally Rhines from TI come in and then set up the design center with with Mon Rao. So, there is that history, but I think India has always been like, we're trying to do something. And so my point is, since I've been covering it since the 90s, there's always been, there's this initiative, that's the initiative, and you had ISA, ISA, all good intentions, whatever, but I think there's just not the momentum or at that time, the expertise to sort of look at that holistic, bigger picture. Didn't answer your question, but I think I gave you
I just wanted to know a number as well. I mean, the top 10, top 20, where are we standing?
It's very difficult to say India is sort of ranking there right now because it doesn't really have anything apart from being a sort of key player in the design area.
Let's just move a little bit in the current geopolitics that happening in the chip war globally, including the supply chain disruptions and stuff like that. And so what are the developments in the current geopolitical semiconductor chip scenario that's panning out, and how does India stand to gain or lose in the process?
Okay, so it's a constantly moving target. There will always be sort of new sanctions, new new developments, new investments. So I don't think we can sort of necessarily say this is what's happening. You've got obviously the US elections. That is going to have a big impact, especially if one specific sort of party wins, then there will be sort of much stronger sanctions maybe. But I think already the current government, the current administration is actually continuing to tighten up on those China trade activities. But interestingly enough, and again, this is a digression. Just I read in a sort of reputed financial newspaper that US and China have come to an agreement on some sustainability issues, literally hot off the press. I think it was in the last few days. So obviously, despite all the trade wars in other areas, they've come to agreement on sort of things related to sustainability. So what I think their politics is something which I don't get involved with, but what I do observe is political browbeating is always going to be there. That we want to sort of protect the US, we want to sort of stop China from developing its own technology. But I think the upshot of that is look at how much China is putting into manufacturing, how much it's putting into developing its own ecosystem. And I think that's one of the things I've seen in my last visit to India. There's a real appetite to develop that ecosystem. You need that whole ecosystem. You can't do everything on your own. You can't just be a manufacturer of this, or you need the suppliers, you need the designers, you need the process engineers, you need everything. And then I think that's one of the areas where I saw in India there's that appetite, and that's what China's doing. So in the whole sort of answer to your about geopolitics, I think it will continue. There's no doubt about it. There'll be the tit for tat and whatever, but it's going to be difficult to see. When I talk to CEOs in the electronics industry around the world, a large proportion of their revenue is from China. I mean, look at Elon Musk. He cancelled his trip to India to go to China, right, because most of his market is in China. So why would he come to India? I'm not being disrespectful. I think I'm just saying from a business point of view, it makes more sense for him. So I think this will always happen, but I think at the end of the day, US and China will still have to do business. Europe and China will still have to do business. India and China will still have to do business. One of the companies I interviewed on my recent visit is one of your top consumer electronics manufacturers, Boat Lifestyle. They do the earbuds, and I sort of interviewed the R&D heads in Bangalore, and the dependence at the beginning on chips from China was so necessary just because the US and European key semiconductor players wouldn't talk to India. They wouldn't talk to a small Indian company. So there's that aspect of cultural. So it's not just geopolitical; it's cultural as well. So I think they still say like if we can get a part that is X dollars from China, it's going to cost X plus or X times 10 from the US. So or from India itself. We don't have that capability yet. So then it's not going to be there. So we still have to do business with China. So I think everybody still has to do business with China. That's given. The problem is how will people find that equilibrium?
I wanted to give two observations or views of mine on this whole issue with Indo-China trade and supply chain, especially during COVID. Some of the startups that have been dependent on China suffered a lot, and many of our automotive, consumer electronic industry also suffered because the whole supply chain was disrupted during the extended lockdowns, and the chips were not reaching Indian shores for assembly into the final product. So heavy dependence on China itself is one of the reasons why we believe that we should be de-risking into other supply locations. If Europe is not able to do that, then whether it's going to be Korea or Taiwan. On Taiwan, I want to have a separate line item discussion as well on a geopolitics side as well. But it's very clear in India that we need to de-risk out of China at this point in time because of whatever our border issues with China, as well as the type of supply lines and disruptions that India has witnessed. Let me tell you, a car in India, which was to be delivered a year back, had almost over a year and a half waiting for delivery, just because semiconductor chips to be embedded into the automotive systems were not available. Although things have now improved, but so these are risks for us to be only dependent on China.
No, I mean, actually, that's a common story around the world. I mean, it was the same whether you're in the Europe or the US. So it's not a India-specific thing. So I think you have to look at the whole supply chain. Semiconductor industry relies on a whole supply chain. So the chips were probably coming not from China, but they're coming from Taiwan or Korea, and then they were being assembled in somewhere like Malaysia or China or Vietnam. So I think the question is not about chips from China. It's about that whole supply chain being disrupted. And what happened was because of COVID, a lot of the sort of OEM OEMs, the manufacturers around the world, said, okay, well, we're going to hold back on our orders for chips. And so the fabs then decided to basically go for the consumer, because all of a sudden people were working from home, so mobiles, laptops, everything. So, the consumer electronics space took up the demand for the chips. And then the automotive manufacturers, when it came back to it, decided to order, but they said, the fab said, well, we're full with capacity with the consumer stuff, so you'll have to wait and put your orders in. So I think that's kind of where I'm sort of very oversimplifying it, but my point is it was not necessarily China. It was basically whole industry attitude towards demand and supply and what inventories we should keep.
Now, the fear in Indian circles is that what India is doing, whether it's purchasing oil from Russia, and it's now recently signed up a port deal for 10 years of lease in Iran, which are anti or enemies of US. And I'm sure at some point in time, there is a fear that what embargoes US has implemented on China could actually also happen on India. And that could mean that India could suffer in the semiconductor supply chain space as well. How true or how real is this fear in what has been echoed in the Indian industry echo chambers?
Okay, I don't live in India. So I'm an external observer, and I don't see the rationale for that kind of thinking. So I think there is definitely, it's very difficult to know what's going on internally in India. But I think what I would say is India is probably not on one of those on the radar of the people who decide on what trade and industry in the US to say, well, it's a threat. I don't know, and I'm not speaking from any knowledge here. I'm just speculating. So
Sure.
Don't have your sort of listeners thinking I'm an expert on that. But I would say that it doesn't seem to be that it would be on the radar for being a security threat. The biggest reasons the US has been given for China and putting them sort of embargoes or sanctions is because of the potential security threat. And I think that happened because ultimately there was one big company, Huawei, for example, what was sort of dominant in almost everything in the telecom space, in the mobile space. So I think that was the big worry for the US. India, you design everything for the chips for the world. You could put Trojan horses into the chips and do that. Is anybody saying that? Is anybody fearing that? Is anybody even capable of doing that? I don't know. I'm speculating. So I think the point is India could be a threat, but I don't think it's seen as a threat. Why would it be unless somebody decided to do something like that?
How real is China's invasion of Taiwan and taking over Taiwan as its own territory?
Okay.
And what happens to TSMC and the world at large?
I'm not an expert on that, but I think what I will say from my own sort of opinion is that if TSMC, if something was to happen to TSMC, just think about everything that's dependent on those advanced technology chips, and pretty much everything we use today. So then the question then is the world heading for a blackout? Are we heading for a stone age?
Okay.
Will the US and China allow that? Will the US and China realize that maybe we need to figure out how to keep talking? I don't know. I'm just it seems like an unlikely scenario unless a major superpower wants to shoot itself in the foot.
So China's intent on taking over Taiwan could actually mean that China could dominate over USA and other countries in the chip war in the foreseeable future, if that happens as a scenario, worst case scenario.
Well, I wouldn't speculate on that because at the moment there is so much dependency that I think even both parties in this, the US and China, have so many interconnected dependencies that they would need to be very sort of considerate about all the consequences before anything like that happens. So again, I'm not a politician, but I think it'll be very, very hard to see why they would sort of take that route unless something really happened that sort of triggered that kind of activity. But I think what's more likely to happen is that this China has been trying to sort of develop its own technologies, its ecosystem, its supply chain. So I think in the face of adversity, necessity is a mother of invention. And I think they don't have the advanced ASML, they don't have the advanced technologies, but then maybe they will find ways. And I think I was reading a report from Bloomberg actually saying that China, it doesn't report its semiconductor industry investments, and so it only comes from sort of think tanks and various other bodies. So maybe there are things happening which we don't know about, and I think it's very, very careful in what's sort of disclosed outside world.
Just one issue that I wanted to understand is this whole issue about sovereign AI and AI used by governments for their own proprietary reasons of governance and managing the country. Now, in India, this whole sovereign AI, before that, India has got its own navigation system. So it's now not on Google Map. Government defense systems, all of them are using India's homegrown systems. Our government computers are no longer on Microsoft or Apple OS. India's got their own OS.
Okay.
And there is a thinking that our investments, whatsoever, little or more, into the semiconductor chip making industry should also propel the next generation of sovereign AI, driving data, hardware, and everything proprietary to India so that there are not leaks or hacks outside to other countries or players who currently are using or Indian government seems to be using to manage the governance systems in India. How do you view this, and where is it going to be really achievable, say in the next 5 years till Modi's next term ends in 2029?
You know, whatever you've quoted there is totally new to me. I didn't know this, so I can only sort of offer an opinion based on very little knowledge of what's happening in India on that front. So the people I was meeting were mostly doing semiconductor development, so looking at, or manufacturing or design companies. So I think it's interesting. I didn't know this, but if that's the case, it would sort of put the meeting I had with Ola, I think it would be quite interesting. It puts that into perspective where you're trying to develop your own sort of India-based ecosystem for the AI, for the generative AI, for the large language models. So I think it may be that that's where. So we have a conference coming up, and Sambit Sahu is going to speak at our conference in July. Be very interesting to see what he talks about. But I think and how much he can reveal. That's my only knowledge right now of what India is doing for its own AI. So I cannot sort of comment on all the other sort of aspects that you mentioned.
Yeah, this is something coming out of the think tanks and government offices, including a few
that's very
side comments coming out of one Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekhar as well, and several other ministers who want to, under the garb of Atmanirbhar India, also want to make India self-reliant on this sort of journey in artificial intelligence.
So it's interesting. I mean, I remember meeting Rajiv Chandrasekhar many times in the 90s when I used to interview him when he was at BPL and BPL Mobile. I've yet to interview him as India's electronics minister. I had been chasing, so maybe one day.
He's very busy.
Yeah, I know he's very busy, especially with the elections. But I mean, on my last trip, I have been speaking to his IAS assistants and all that. But the thing I would say is one thing that fascinates me is very few countries where you have somebody who's actually qualified to actually be in a government position. And I might be told off now by many people around the world because there may be lots of countries. But in my limited knowledge, I guess. So I think it's quite refreshing that he and I think the other minister are ex-electronic engineers, and I think Rajiv Chandrasekhar worked on x86, if I remember. So the point is, it's probably, if they're talking about something, it's probably something they have thought about and are able to see through, whereas others, in their 5-year terms, they'll talk about something and then move on, and it just gets somebody else takes over and then has another idea, and then it happens in British politics as well. So it's not a big new thing. My point is, it's actually good to see people like that in sort of positions like that, because then maybe they can make a difference to India, which hasn't happened before. And I think that might be something that might be a little bit more of a catalyst for you.
Great. Let's move to India's chip intent and policy and direction. Right now, I've interacted with both the Vinods of the chip and the semiconductor industry. Vinod Dham of Pentium Frame and Vinod Khosla of Khosla Ventures of Sun Microsystem. I've had one-on-one with them on sidelines at certain events and certain other policy making think tanks. Now, both of them, have said that India has lost the race as far as the semiconductor industry is concerned. In fact, Vinod Dham actually said that India is 50 years behind, right? Now, just investing a couple of $1 billion and allowing for incentive just to put up a fabrication unit in India in joint partnership with whoever, whether it's Elon Musk or whatever, is not going to get India into some sort of a leadership position. It may probably ensure that you're de-risking yourself geopolitically in case the supply lines, get disrupted, given whatever the situation and the war conditions that are there. And we have seen this happening in other industries, for instance, in telecom, where, India was not even a player in the telecom industry value chain. And today, we are the largest users of data, the most cheapest one. We've got the scale, and we are the biggest innovators, whether it's 5G and now 6G technologies as well, correct?
Yeah.
So I wanted to discuss and deliberate, are we going in the right direction of investing into fabrication, or why don't we leverage our core strengths? I mean, when I was heading Wipro, we used to do a lot of design work for a whole host of, US healthcare players. I can talk about healthcare because that's where I used to, lead. And they were successfully, implemented or assembled into a whole host of their latest emerging product lines, right? And to say that we have already, and you also mentioned about 20% of global workforce in the design itself, why don't we kind of use the NVIDIA model? They design and then they'll allow the fabrication to a player who has scale and can produce it cheaply. So these are the kind of, issues in my mind around the current semiconductor policy and incentives that the government is offering. Are we in the right direction? What are your thoughts? And then we can kind of dive deeper in looking at what are the kind of potential directions that India should be probably looking at. One, obviously, we just discussed about, the Atmanirbhar, under the Atmanirbhar, why the whole fab and investments are happening. But directionally, I'm not very confident. Why are we really pursuing something that we are already lagging behind?
So I've interviewed, okay, let's go back to telecom. You're talking about telecoms and mobile. So since, I told you about, sort of starting to visit India in 1993 and writing about it, then I used to cover the whole mobile technology emergence. And I give you a little anecdote. Hutchison Max, or Max, whatever it was, in Mumbai at that time. So since I was writing about it, they gave me one of the mobiles they had, and I was going on the Bombay local train and talking on the phone, and people were looking at me saying, "What's this man doing?" This is 1994 or 95. I can't remember when it was.
It happened to me as well. I had the BPL mobile at that point in time.
Yeah. So the point is, like, I was covering that and following that from 93 to 98, looking at the whole sort of fiasco with the regulatory stuff as well, TRAI, and then the licenses. So it sort of came to an equilibrium at some point, and then as soon as certain regulatory things came in place, and then that just sort of went boom for the mobile industry, which was actually quite good. It comes back to sort of having, and that was driven really by the private sector. So if you take that parallel, there's been an Indian Semiconductor Association for a while. They've been talking about 400 million ESDM market or 400 million or billion, whatever, for ESDM market for a long time in India. And I've been writing about it for many years, including some of my peers as well in the international media industry. But I think there was a lack of any motivation from anybody to do anything. And I think that's, the private sector really should have led it. I mean, if you look at all the investments now by Intel, TSMC, in fabs in Europe, in Japan, in the US, they're led by the private sector, but they're obviously looking for government subsidies and grants, and that's how it all works. I don't think that whole, the whole triumvirate of things was happening in India, and I think that's probably why it's been so slow, and that's why Vinod Dham said, 50 years behind. Yes, of course, because nobody's really been doing anything about it until maybe now, but even 10 billion is not significant. And so then what is that? Is that a token gesture? Is that just to say, well, look, everybody talks about having semiconductor resilience, semiconductor supply chain resilience, let's just do something. You're looking at 28 nanometer technology at the best with the Tata PSMC, not TSMC, PSMC. And I don't know whether their technologies, I haven't studied their technology, so I can't, but what I'm saying is it's the 10 billion or 15 billion is a token gesture right now, but I think if it mobilizes some private investments, that might help a little bit, but I think it's not leading edge. So you're not going to be supplying your sort of mobiles, your computers, your AI. It's going to be, more the industrial electronics, the robotics, maybe that kind of stuff, the automation, the defense. Those are the things that you're making yourselves a little bit more self-sufficient on, not necessarily more advanced technology, because, that comes from TSMC and Samsung and Intel. So again, your question about, well, should we focus on what we're good at? Yes. I interviewed, and it's in Times, I interviewed one of the ministers in Latvia, and talking about their semiconductor policy. This 2 years ago. Latvia is a country in Eastern Europe, case some of the listeners don't know. So I was in Riga for a 5G conference, and so one of the things he said is, we can't do what all the other European countries are doing, but we're good at certain things like augmented reality, mixed reality, design and technology. So we're going to be putting into skills in that. So our semiconductor strategy is providing the skills for that particular part of it. So when you talk about digital twins and simulation, that's kind of where they're going. So I think India could focus on on that design. But I think, at the end of the day, I'm not one of the people advising on policy, so I can't say what their thinking is. But maybe the thinking is, there are certain areas where maybe we can keep, maintain a bit of resilience. And this is where, it's not leading edge technologies, but it's, the big Tata and PSMC, and then also maybe some, manufacturing. I went to visit Keynes Semicon, Raghu Panikar. So I'd talked to him in quite some depth about some of the things they're doing in the manufacturing in terms of packaging and assembly for high performance computing, which is basically delivering for next generation AI. And they're providing some of the technology for manufacturing for CDAC, the Rudra processors. So I think, that there are things that you're doing in India, but I think it should be under no illusion that India is going to be a semiconductor powerhouse. It's going to be a powerhouse in something specific that it does. And that may be certain areas of design, but also certain areas of manufacturing and assembly. So you have to have the right context perspective.
Yeah, so let's kind of go from the design into services like assembly, testing, and further development, SOIC, and stuff like that, where you kind of starting to value add on the AI side of things. And then perhaps, when the confidence of the world comes that, okay, these guys know what they're talking and the ecosystem is there, then you can make big bang investments with the private sector with little sliver of incentive from the government on taxes and whatever other things that the government offers. Is that not the right way to move forward?
I guess so. And if you look at some of the moves right now in the industry, in the electronics industry, to deliver that high performance computing and more than more, as they call it, or beyond more, Moore's law. And one of the technologies is actually chiplets. So basically, it's like little chip blocks. Let's take the rationale back. So for example, chips were all sort of developed as monolithic ICs, one single IC.
Correct.
So if smaller process technologies, so if you go into 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer, if you're developing one chip, all of that chip has to be in that technology. So it's very expensive. And, you can't deliver these expensive chips for something that is not going to be cost viable. So and also, you can't deliver that level of performance and compute. So what they've started talking about is, okay, let's break it up into blocks. So the bit that needs the fastest, the process technology, we can use as a chip block there. It's a chiplet. And then the ones which are older technologies, like maybe the ones that Tata is producing, then that can be another chip block. And then we put those together on a super chip, as it were, like the Grace Hopper chip, the NVIDIA super chip. So that's effectively, it's not chiplets, but I think that's kind of that principle. So if you do that, India is actually quite good at the design, the test, the verification. And one of the challenges with chiplets, and this is what we're going to be addressing at our conference on July the 24th and 25th with the Times. So, and we have some key speakers from Synopsys, Cadence, Intel. Sambit is also speaking from Ola. So if you have those skills, why not use those skills to deliver that next generation of high performance computing through chiplets? I mean, at the moment, people are talking about it being too expensive for anything other than maybe areas like automotive. Maybe there's a way India can find it to figure out how to put these things together at a lower cost. I'm just speculating, by the way. This is totally off the cuff with you, Kapil.
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole idea of having a kind of conversation, because it throws up ideas and opens up discussion in terms of, are we in the right direction? Are we in the wrong direction? What can we do better? How can we make it cheaper, better, faster?
Yeah.
You talked about, chip on chip things, but you see, one of the great strides that India has made, and we did a podcast also on AI and how India could be a leader and a global leader in AI itself, given that whatever is happening in the western part of the world or the leaders, India is doing a catch up within 6 months or so into the ecosystem here. And not to say that our traditional ancient languages have a store of value, and those sort of language models, none of the Western world can actually develop. So
yeah, I know. Yeah.
So there is a whole thinking here that our software side of things, where we are able to develop a lot of language models and neural learning models and stuff like that, coupled with what we do on our embedded system design and software on the system to run. Can India not even dominate creating AI-based software to manage the chips so that their speeds and processing capability can be enhanced, errors can be debugged on the chip itself through the AI process? And although we are 50 years behind, but we leapfrog from there into more from where we are talented and we have the resource pool and the talent to actually emerge out as leaders. How do you think this could probably emerge out now that there's a whole this buzz of AI and
Yeah.
NVIDIA valuation going off the roof and everything,
So-
compute power on AI. How do
Yeah,
we
I
now
think-
kind of leverage our capabilities onto the semiconductor industry and we merge out more on the services and then perhaps see where we can lead this? Let all the ASMCs and TSMCs and the
So-
Samsungs of the world drive whatever they can.
Let me just play that to a logical sort of progression there. And I think it does make sense to, because of the design skills, the software skills, to be able to build not just the software, but the chip designs that enable, that are optimized. Again, when I met the R&D heads at Boat in Bangalore, it was quite fascinating to see how they're looking to optimize the chip design itself for what they're delivering, which is basically the wearables, and earbuds. So I think there is an opportunity where you have the knowledge on the chip design, you have the capability on the software to build some kind of powerhouse. I don't know, like an Apple or an Nvidia, if somebody wanted to actually do that. But I think unless somebody with a bright idea does that, it's a long way away still. But it needs somebody with a bit of vision. And this is one of the things I interviewed Satya Gupta in Bangalore 3 times on my last visit as well, and he was telling me how I'm not sure if it was him or somebody else, but how the Indian mindset is still focused on that service as opposed to creating something
Innovating
that will be
it.
big, and marketing as well and commercialization. So I think the whole thing from my last visit to India was there's a lack of skills in India in certain areas, and
Correct.
and you have the design skills, you have the you have the technological skills. And one lady, Lalita from Intel, she's going to be on my conference as well, speaking on chiplets. But I think she said the technology is there. We can solve any technology problems. The issue is not the technology and solving the technology problems. It's the mindsets, the culture, the commercial, the communication skills. And I think that's where maybe something can change in the semiconductor industry in India to have that kind of thinking. And for that, where does it start? Does it start with the IITs? Does it start with people coming back from the US and Europe to India to create those? I mean, they were doing it in Taiwan and China. I mean, if you look at some of the most successful entrepreneurs in Taiwan and China, they actually US returnees. By the way, just a side note, I do a series called Silicon Grapevine on EE Times, and basically that talks about the personal and professional journeys of CEOs in the industry. And okay, predominantly in Silicon Valley, but 80% or 70 or 80% of them are Indian. So it just goes to show, they have created things in the US and Europe. So why not in India? So I think there is that possibility, but you need to get out of some mindset, and I don't know what that is, but that's what people are telling me. Indian engineering community or Indian semiconductor industry doesn't have that mindset.
As a side note and an anecdote, currently we are going through the festival of democracy in the world.
Yes.
And
16
our electronic
odd
voting
nations.
machines
Yes.
have our own, locally designed chip, which are not hackable, foolproof, weatherproof, and cannot be hacked. And no courts in the world have proven that our elections are rigged. So we should be proud and pat on our back as well.
No, that's good. I mean, I actually didn't.
And it's been designed by
a
an IIT professor.
Yeah, I didn't know that, but I think that's a very useful thing for me to follow up.
So
we
also innovate when there is a democratic pressure to facilitate democracy in India.
So you raised another good point, actually. Security, cybersecurity is going to, with all of this data, all of this technology, cybersecurity is going to be a big issue. So I think again, India has a potential to maybe develop solutions that are hard built into the hardware. And there are companies doing it around the world, but I'm not sure I've identified any in India yet, but I'm sure there must be.
Well, there are, at least in our defense and aerospace side of it.
Okay.
I want to, just as an anecdotal discussion here, you talked about several Indians who are successful when they have left Indian shores in the US in the semiconductor space. I wanted to bring about a few examples. Let me start with health. There's a bunch of guys who are chip designers, and this is what I can say a rub-off effect onto other sectors in innovation. They use the chip design technology to actually design hospitals, and they are VC funded and PE funded out of Silicon Valley. Bunch of Indians. I'm giving you a few such examples here. There's another bunch of chip designers who use the algorithm of how the chip internal compute power and systems on board are used and optimized to actually use it in chemistry and biology for drug discovery purposes. Again, a VC funded company, and done something phenomenally good, not just in India, but for the world. I wanted to understand And this sort of rub-off effect, anything that comes to your mind in other sectors that are emerging from Indian chip design expertise?
So again, I wouldn't be able to answer that question just because I don't have that much exposure. We are looking to do a lot more coverage of what's going on in India. So I think our coverage of India has been limited just because, like, people, whenever we ask them to report on it, they just talk about the same thing all the time. I've been saying to our publisher, we need to have fresh voices, fresh people talking about what's going on, what's new. And I think that's one of the areas we would be like to be looking at a little bit more. So can't answer your question, but I think I'm sure I'll be able to identify some of those.
I would love to host you on a few such guys who I keep meeting as part of our investment activity on innovation.
Yeah.
My focus predominantly is healthcare life sciences domain,
That's
but
right.
other domains as well around artificial intelligence and chip designers actually using certain design principles to solve problems into allied sectors like healthcare and many others.
Well, just taking it a little bit more broadly, I think when I speak to investors and sort of serial entrepreneurs in the US and Europe, one of the key areas that they are looking at for future is healthcare. So investing in healthcare. So it is a thing, and it is going to be a much bigger thing, especially as populations age around the world. So I think it's the right area to be looking at.
In fact, I would urge you to go through our health manifesto where we have put 40 bets, and those 40 bets roll out into close to about 360 sub bets, leveraging on different tech, artificial intelligence, morphogenic technologies, including genetics and many other areas to enable the future of healthcare and life sciences out of India. And if even a few of those bets take shape, I think we are adding another $30 to $50 billion of additional GDP through healthcare to our country as well. And some of these could become global unicorns as well as we go ahead. So this is something that we did as a part of our contribution and thought process. I'll send you a copy of that report as well to you.
Sure.
Great. Nitin, I know you are, when I met you at the NASCOM 10 years back,
yes,
full of energy, full of ideas, and I kind of see your writings and your thoughts and your post on LinkedIn. When am I going to see Nitin as an author?
Well, author of a book, you probably mean, but it's one of my passions to write. I know this rapid fire, but I'll just expand a little bit. One of the things I've sort of discovered in my career. So I born in India, raised in the UK, but working in a global industry, and started in semiconductors 40 years ago this year. So 1984, National Semiconductor. So one of the things I think I found quite fascinating was how Indians were sort of dominating Silicon Valley, because I used to travel to Silicon Valley regularly for my work, and how I didn't have that connect with India because I was in the UK. So early on, my thinking was something around that sort of collaboration between India, US, and UK. It sort of had some ideas about books, but I think now, if I had to write it, I'm now over 60 years old, so very different thinking. But one of the things I think is just how I would talk about my journey, but in a fun way, and highlight some of the experiences. I'm a mentor at London Business School on their entrepreneurship program. I've been for the last 9 years. So it's just something that and the reason I started Silicon Grapevine on EE Times is very similar to what I was doing for the Chile back in 2000, is basically profiling people to provide role models, mentor people so that they can learn from other people's experiences. So maybe the book has to be on, so it was a long answer, but I'm too busy doing what I do with EE Times right now, but I think in maybe another 2 or 3 years, there may be a book on that journey and sort of the various aspects of it.
Excellent. Nitin, you have spent some time as a country representative or UKTI on technology.
Yes.
And given the current geopolitics that is playing out, I feel that is a new domain that is going to come out. Technology diplomat.
I could certainly be a technology diplomat.
And our current foreign minister, I'm hoping that he should continue in the next 5 years as well. I think India should actually put in technology diplomats or attaches, trade attaches in every of their key embassies as well. And that is a subject I'm not sure anybody has written or talked about. And you should be one of the leading proponents to talk about it and actually create a subject matter for trade diplomats in technology.
So actually,
sorry,
my role with no, it's funny.
I'm just making an observation, but I feel that there is a big need now, given what is happening with US, China, all the kind of trade wars and everything that's swooping around, trade barriers around technology. We need something like this.
So I totally agree with you. And if you want to put in a word for me with your minister, definitely.
I'm also waiting to meet Rajiv.
Well,
Maybe
I've
both
already
of
met
us
him,
can
but
go and meet.
I've already met him many years ago, but I want to meet him in his current role. No, my point is, so when I was working as an advisor with UKTI, I think one of the things they recognized is government doesn't really have any expertise in specific subject areas, and technology was one of those. So I was one of maybe 2 or 3 specialists at that time who were on contract to do that role, and I would go around speaking at conferences around the world and taking trade delegations to different countries: US, Brazil, India, Middle East, Africa. So I think it's definitely something that governments and trade missions should consider a little bit more seriously. I have met people who are technologists who have gone into sort of diplomat type roles, but not diplomat. It's more trade advisor. So I think it'd be good to have that diplomat role, and I think I'd be very keen on exploring that.
Final comments before I let you go. We started with the topic of moving around the future of chip in AI dominated India. How do you want to close this talk today with me? So
I think
Moore's dead. I believe we concluded.
So I think I wouldn't say Moore's law is dead. I think people are trying to keep Moore's law alive by doing various things like advanced technologies, advanced chiplets. But how would you like to close? I think India, the audience, your audience is in India, and I think India is one of those countries which has always had a potential for being good at something. It sort of managed to do that in IT and software and services. It managed to do that in chip design and the development of IP for other companies. And I think if it was able to capitalize on that and not chase something that just for politics is the right thing to do, then I think there's a whole new era opening up for India. But I think there's an opportunity also. I think I still remember my conversation with Satya Gupta, and I think there's an opportunity for an Indian. And I think I wrote an article about this. Can India create the next Steve Jobs many years ago? And I think for India to create that kind of Steve Jobs in India for India.
Great, Nitin. It's really pleasure speaking to you and get your thought on this subject, because many of our bet on our next 5-year investment manifesto in healthcare and life sciences also depends on artificial intelligence, and to drive that local language models and the neural networks and then the hardware and the software to enable that at the back end of it is something dependent on the semiconductors. And we do hope, based on this, that some thought in our ecosystem in India, given your global views and perspective and your depth of experience in the industry for over 40 years, is going to make certain new line of thinking as to how do we leapfrog ahead in the years to come.
Well, I would recommend following on EE Times, My Silicon Grapevine, look at some of the conferences we do. I think, and then I would say that I'd like to be covering India a little bit more, and I think we probably will in some way. So yes, definitely.
Count me in when you have an India chapter or whatever you want. More than happy to connect some of the dots, and also perhaps into the power centers in New Delhi with whatever little connects that I have.
All right. Well, good, Kapil. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time today. Lovely talking to you. And listeners, here's what we have on our discussion on moving around the future of chip in AI dominated India. Thanks, and
thank you.
Have a nice day ahead.
Thank you.
Bye.